There is one thing more evil than oppression in the shape of wrongdoing, and that is oppression in the guise of good. Witches were quite bad enough, or rather they would have been, had that which was alleged of them been true. But a man who got his living by creating suspicion regarding them, and following it out to the practical consummation of a hideous death, was 1,000 times worse. In the full tally of the 2 centuries during which the witch mania existed in England, it is impossible to parallel the baseness of the one man who distinguished himself in this loathsome occupation. The facts of his history speak for themselves. Matthew Hopkins was born in Suffolk early in the 17th century. He was the son of a minister, James Hopkins of Wenham. He was brought up for the law, and when enrolled as an attorney, practiced in Ipswich, but after a while he moved to Manningtree where, after he had given up the law, he took to the calling of Witchfinder, being the first person in England to follow that honourable trade. If he had had no suitable opportunities of earning an honest livelihood and been graced with no education, some excuse might have been offered for his despicable calling. But when we remember that he passed his youth in a household practicing religion, and was a member of a learned profession, it is difficult to find words sufficiently comprehensive for the fit expression of our natural indignation against him. If picturesque profanity were allowable, it might be well applied to this despicable wretch and his nefarious labours. In no imaginable circumstances could there possibly be anything to be said in mitigation of his infamy. When we think that the whole ritual of oppression was in his own hands, that he began with lying and perjury, and ended with murder, that he showed, throughout, ruthless callousness for the mental and physical torture of great numbers of the most helpless class of the community, the poor, the weak, the suffering, the helpless and hopeless, that when once his foul imagination had consecrated any poor wretch to destruction, or his baleful glance had unhappily lighted on some unsuspecting victim, there was for such only the refuge of death, and that by some means of prolonged torture, we cannot find any hope or prospect even in evil dreams of the netherworld, of any adequate punishment for his dreadful sins. When we remember that this one man was in himself responsible for what amounted to the murder of some 200 women whom he pursued to the death, the magnitude of his guilt can be guessed but not realized. He occupied 3 whole years in his fell work, and in those years, 1644 through 1646, he caused a regular reign of terror throughout the counties of Huntingdon, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. He had a gang of his own to help him in his gruesome work of discovering witches, amongst whom was a wretch called John Stern and a woman, whose name is unrecorded. These 3 had a sort of mock assize of their own. They made regular tours of discovery, at a charge of 20 shillings for expenses at each place they visited. There appears to have been a fee paid or exacted for each witch bagged. In 1645, which was perhaps his best year, the price declined to a shilling a head. Hopkins and his gang took comfort, however, from the fact that the industry was a growing one. The trade had only been initiated in 1644, and already in a year's time he had in one day procured the execution of 18 alleged witches, and at the end of that assize, after the jail delivery had been effected, 120 suspects still awaited trial. In the skillful hands of Matthew Hopkins, trial was only a step on the road to certain execution by one of the forms in use. Here came in, not only the witchfinder's legal knowledge, but also his gift of invention, the latter being used in the formulation of so-called tests which were bound to be effective. Of these the simplest was the water test. The subject's thumbs were tied together and she was then thrown into water of sufficient depth. If she did not drown, it was taken as a proof of guilt, and she was hanged by form of law. Such was the accuracy as well as the simplicity of similar tests that, in the 20 years previous to the Restoration, between 3,000 and 4,000 alleged witches perished in England from one cause or another. Hopkins professed to be both just and merciful. He seemed generally willing to afford a test to the accused, though the result was always the same. In such cases the test was eminently calculated to evoke confession, and such confession, no matter how ridiculous or extravagant it might be, was simply a curved road to the rope or the torch instead of a straight one. One of these pleasing tests was to place the old woman, they were all women and all old, sitting cross-legged on a stool or table where she could be well watched. She was generally kept in that position under inspection, without food or water, for 24 hours. At the end of that time such resolution as had remained disappeared, and in the vain blind hope of some change for the better, some alleviation however slight of the grinding misery, of the agony of body and mind and soul, they confessed. In judging Matthew Hopkins one must not, in justice to others, accord him any of the consideration which is the due of good intent. Not a score of years after his shameful death, a man was born in a newer land far beyond the separating sea. We refer to Cotton Mather, who believed he wrought for the Lord in New England. But guilt does not attach to him. He was an earnest, though mistaken man, and the results of his mistaken teaching were at variance with the trend of his kindly, godly life. It must be pleasing to think of the manner of the death of Matthew Hopkins. 3 years had exhausted not only the material available for his chosen work, but, what was worse for him, the patience of the community. He had given cause for scandal in even his own degraded trade and in himself, the filthiest thing in connection with it. Not content with dealing with the poor, helpless folk, whom he had come to regard as his natural prey, he went on fancy flights of oppression. At last he went too far. He ventured to denounce an aged clergyman of blameless life. The witch fever was too strong for justice in any form, and neither age, high character, nor sacred office could protect this gentleman of 80 years of age. He too was tortured, till in a moment of unhinged mind, he confessed as he was ordered, and was duly hanged. This was in 1645. The old man's death was not in vain, for it was made the occasion of much necessary plain speaking. Presently the public conscience was wakened, chiefly by another cleric, the Reverend John Call, vicar of Great Staunton, Huntingdonshire, who, though he believed in witchcraft, realized the greater evil wrought by men like Hopkins. He published a pamphlet in which he denounced Hopkins as a common nuisance. The result, if slow, was sure. The Witchfinder never recovered from the shock of Call's vigorous attack. In 1647, on information based on Hopkins' own rules, he was arrested and subjected to the test which he had devised. He was tied by the thumbs and thrown into the water. Unfortunately for himself he withstood the test and so was by process of law duly hanged.